We have a society now that, by and large, um, doesn't trust authority. It's kind of funny because I remember when I was in Berkeley, I would often see this bumper sticker that said "Question authority." This was kind of a leftist thing to do. Um, Now, I remember even then being sort of seeing through it. It's just like, well, they want you to question one kind of authority, but they have their own authority, which they don't want you to question. Um, but now this come true, but in a way that these leftists never could imagine. The questioning is actually it's across the political spectrum, but it's especially concentrated, let's say, on the right side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I think this trust in science perhaps is the most damaging of all of the collapses of trust in institutions. The government, there's always been mistrust, it's politics, but the idea is that science is supposed to be impervious to political corruption. This is hard science. And so when we see that that science itself has become corrupted, and we lose trust in that, then what can you trust? And then that's why we have people out there that are flat earthers. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
they lied to me about all this stuff. I can't
Yeah,
trust them on anything.
right. Yeah, I think a lot of people, I would say, are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, yeah, I went into, let's say, COVID with a great deal of trust in our public health institutions. And initially I tried to hold on to it. But then over time, I just saw that it had become politicized. It had become an instrument of one side in a political battle, in a culture war. And, I don't, yeah, so I found that trust had been abused that I had. It's just like, yeah, listen to us. We know what we're doing. Over time, it became clear, no, they don't know what they're doing. They're not being open about it. And, they're making decisions for political reasons or they're just trying to cover their own errors. It's just there clearly was a lot of malfeasance, let's say, on the part of these public health institutions. And so now I'm skeptical, of what, and that's actually quite unfortunate. You would like to live in a society where you have trustworthy, public health authorities who can provide you with guidelines and you can follow them because you don't have the specialized training. These are important decisions. What should I take the shot? Is this, what um, we're talking about our health and, some cases our lives. Um, and, again, you would want to be able to trust these authorities. Now, by and large, I do, I listen to my doctor and so on and so forth. But I have to admit that it was a blow, and I find it actually disconcerting because I don't really have the time to figure out everything. Like, should I take this shot or not, or what, before I always assumed it was right. Now I just don't know. I'll just say I'm a skeptic, but I don't claim to know exactly what's going on, and I find that rather unsettling. And So that's just one example, but that's my own experience. But a lot of people went through that, and I think they drew a they leaped to a really far-reaching conclusion that science is bunk. So you have people. I know people, and I have to say a lot of them are intelligent people. I think even there's a flat earther, who I know who's really quite a smart guy. I don't know quite how he believes in this, but he's a smart guy. I'll admit it. He's a lot smarter than I am when it comes to all kinds of technical problems and so forth. Um, but just questions like, does the sun go around the earth or the earth go around the sun? It was just at one time I never had knew anybody that thought that the sun went around the earth. I thought that had been resolved centuries ago.
Yeah,
But now
Galileo figured it out, right?
yeah, well, yeah, it's actually, I think more it was Kepler. Yeah, but
Oh, okay.
yeah, okay. But anyway, this is, I thought these were settled questions, but what's happened is that people, once they lost that trust, they start to just believe what they want to believe. Um, and, in a, and you can't blame them in a way, like, let's just take that question of the sun, whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun. Um, I think I would it would be fair to say that probably close to above 95% of the population whether they believe in a heliocentric, a sun-centric view, or a geocentric, an earth-centric view, really couldn't explain to you why they believe it. They couldn't provide you some sort of proof. The vast majority of people don't really know this, what the experiments that were done that demonstrated the heliocentric position. They just trust. That's how it's been. I remember when I began my education in graduate school. It was the Department of Sociology and UCSD. I think it may have been the very first day or one of the first days. There was a professor that gave us a presentation of the kind of work that he does. And it was on, he calls it, or, it's a well-known branch of sociology called social constructionism. And he pointed out that, look, it's like our knowledge, it's not like we actually have done the experiments. We were eyewitnesses to the event. There's always some trust involved, and there are mediating institutions. It's like your belief that the sun is at the center and the planets go around it. Well, that's because you believe the institutions that teach you this, and you could say that about everything, whether it's all kinds of scientific and other matters. And this is so your knowledge, in a sense, is socially constructed. Now, I'm not a social constructionist because I think they go too far and they end up actually just denying that there's reality at all. But there is a great deal of truth to that. That's how, we kind of navigate our lives. And very few of us have the time to go past just that kind of rather superficial trust. And so when that trust evaporates, then people start believing everything. Even, and I'm not saying they're stupid people, they can be very smart, but they just become deeply cynical and they just stop believing anything that they're told. And that's where we are. It's because this general lack of trust, this politicization, has seeped into institutions that had always been been sanctuaries, had been non-political, and had kind of kept above the culture war. But now they've been brought into the culture war, and then that has really damaged them. So we're seeing this erosion of trust even in science.
Do we have any historical precedents for something like this, where we have this type of systemic collapse in institutions, the trust in institutions?
Yeah, well, certainly not. In institutions. Well, yeah, I think probably you find similar. There are many empires that have fallen, governments have fallen, and they grow corrupt over time. They begin to lose their legitimacy. I don't really, I couldn't provide you any hard data, but I'm sure that you find similar trends in Russia prior to the revolution, or in France prior to their revolution. I mean, it's something that you find.
What about in China during the Cultural Revolution? Was there a complete?
Well, the Cultural Revolution, that was a time of ideological fervor when people really, believed deeply in Mao. They had almost a magical. They saw him almost as God, and there were even stories that people would burn incense to him and that kind of thing. I think actually the loss of trust that followed the Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao, and then the overthrow of the Gang of Four, and then the return of Deng Xiaoping. And there was a loss of trust. That was something I think the Chinese authorities, this is kind of a tangent, but it's important. They were greatly worried about it. They understood that there had been a profound loss of trust because of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, the obvious mistakes that Mao had made. And so they worked hard, to preserve let's say a core of trust. They admitted to certain errors. They said that, I can't remember exactly the percentage, said that Mao was right 70% of the time, something like that.
Right.
And
they still say that in China,
Okay,
they still say that, yeah.
Yeah.
He's 70% good, 30% bad.
Yeah, right. So that's something that the Communist Party worked out. It's just like, okay, we can't have people just completely rejecting our authority. The Communist Party runs all the institutions basically within China. So a loss of faith in the Communist Party is just a loss of faith in all institutions. So they very carefully, kind of they criticized Mao. They admitted to certain errors, but they limited the criticism. They kind of, you could say, just kind of cordoned it off. Said, okay, we can say this and so much, but the Communist Party was always good. And we learned from these errors, not necessarily minor errors, and we're just going from strength to strength from now on. So I think it was successful. Now, in Russia, you find something different. Of course, there was just a total collapse and a total repudiation of the past. And you have to say that created this huge crisis in Russia that did not occur in China. And it's just the Russians have been kind of, ever since really Putin took power, have been trying to put the pieces back together. But I'm sure, I haven't seen the hard data, but I bet that if you looked at, similar polling data similar to the ones that I was just describing, I mean, on the same topics, the same questions, you would see the reverse trend. You would see it very, very low in the 1990s and then climbing steadily since. They have been kind of putting back together the pieces there.
Well, in the case of Russia, or you say the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was a clear collapse and a clear realization that, okay, we need to pick up the pieces because the house has fallen down. And the Cultural Revolution, I think it's also something similar. This is an actual revolution. We haven't experienced something like this in the United States. Do you think that's what we need? Is the house actually has to fall down? We have to have a true collapse, or maybe we break off into separate states, there's secession movements or something like this, or there's some type of revolution. Is that what is required to rebuild?
Yeah, well, I guess it's just my own sense of it. This is not something that I can prove or, anybody can know for sure, but it's that these institutions do need to collapse in some sense. They need to fall, and we need to build up from the ground again. That a lot of them have become so thoroughly compromised. I'm not saying all of them, but so many of them have been so thoroughly compromised that they can't seem incapable of reforming themselves.
Would you include the government in that? Because that's obviously the big one. There's just this complete lack of trust in the government. So if you say if that institution needs to fall down, then
right. I know that it's scary. Maybe there will be some sort of reform that'll that will rise within the government. It will result from elections, but again,
does that ever happen? Like, realistically, can you point to times when that's happened? It always feels, maybe just because that history's not so interesting. It's like things were getting kind of bad.
Yeah.
I think we fixed it,
Right. No, I should get back to my history books, but it
doesn't seem like it. It seems like it always, but that's the history that's written, but.
Right. Well, there certainly have been huge crises, like, for example, the Weimar Republic in Germany. I think there was they had hyperinflation. There was an extreme loss of faith in the government. The government had been, the German government had been, because of its association with the surrender at the end of World War One, and had lost legitimacy. The people had placed their faith in it, thought that, okay, this government, our authorities know what they're doing, and then all of a sudden one day they were told that they had lost, and misery ensued. There had been the suffering during the war, but they continued to suffer, and so there was this general loss of trust in the government. Of course, there was a new government that replaced it, but it wasn't able to escape that general collapse in trust. And that created a vacuum, of course, for the rise of the Nazi Party. So, that's just one recent, example in the last century.
Well, you're saying that it reformed and produced Hitler, though, right?
Well, in this case, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's just like when people become desperate, they lose their faith, and sort of everything becomes possible. And I guess that's what I say. I do feel in general, it's on one level, it's healthy that we're seeing this growing skepticism because these institutions in general do not deserve our trust. I wouldn't extend it to physics departments or anything like that, but um, but but everything from the Congress to public health authorities to the media, yeah, they really don't deserve our trust. We should be skeptical, in varying degrees. It doesn't mean that they always lie, but we have a reason to suspect that they may be lying, and that's unfortunate, but that's where we are, and that's being realistic. So to that extent, it's healthy. But the problem with that, again, is because people, again, their knowledge is socially constructed to a great extent. It's based on trust in institutions, and when that's gone, what fills it? How many people actually go out and really study things and figure out whether the sun goes around the earth or the other way around? Do they do the experiments, or do they even know the experiments? That's just, again, one example, but it's just like everything, all kinds of questions. Of course, more relevant would be just political and social questions. Do they really think of? Well, there becomes a cacophony of voices out there, and the internet makes it possible. Right, so anybody can find an internet soapbox, get on it, and start to, present his particular version of things, his version of reality. And you'll find, I think we find this happening already. There's just sort of a multiplication of not cults. That wouldn't be the right word, but just sort of different versions of reality, I'll just say at this point. And where that can lead to, I don't know, it's any guess. It's just sort of potentially that will, can take us to some kind of renaissance. Yeah, okay, it's good that we have alternative channels of information, and that we don't have to depend on these corrupt and dying institutions, and we can start to rebuild, or maybe we can start to, reconstruct our society. But it can take any form. It really can. I don't think there's any guarantees that it was going to end well. It may, just looking at the current state of things, it's just that it's chaotic. The skepticism of authority is growing, and is reasonable. Again, we should be skeptical. And it accounts for things like the Trump phenomenon. He's the sort of person that could not have been elected 20 years ago when people, believed in the serious, responsible people. A lot of that trust was misplaced, but there was still a fair amount of trust at that time. So you have somebody like this who is clearly kind of, is a loose cannon and just doesn't observe the conventions. He can become elected. And now what we're seeing now with Trump is just sort of is chaos more than anything. Chaos can be good, it's sort of like a cannon that's firing in many directions. It's punched holes in walls that probably should go down. We talked about, like, for the work of Doge and the exposure of the USAID, that kind of thing. These are, actually good events. But but then we have the tariffs and everything else. It just, I see in general, like, just looking at the kind of, let's say, the populist movement in the United States, that I do see a lot of chaos. Just sort of, it's inchoate. There are a lot of feelings about what's right, but there isn't really anything like an intellectual framework. And I know in the past I've likened it to, like, the early decades of the 20th century in China. When it became clear that the old system, which was the dynasties, the imperial system that had ruled China for over 2,000 years, was failing. It was coming to an end. And that these new challenges, or these institutions were unable. That is, the system was unable to meet the new challenges, the challenges of this the new era that China was in, the 20th century. But he didn't. it was a time of great chaos. Of course, you had the warlords, and there was a multiplication of different kinds of movements. And one of them was the Boxers. Imagine, was an example. That was a great uprising, but it was based on a lot of superstitions, and that the communists making them out to be heroes. But if you look at it, it was in the end they did a lot. They harmed their own cause, I would say, and. They didn't really have a program for success. You had, of course, earlier in the middle of the 19th century, because I think you can actually go back to the 19th century. You had the Taiping Rebellion, that led to the deaths of something like 20 million people, and it was based again on the notion that there was a certain man that was a brother of Jesus, and he kind of created his own new religion and social movement. So there are a lot of these things, and one of them was actually. Was communism. That was the one, which won out. You'd have to say that it was a superior form of organization, at least as a political movement. It won out over the others and was able to rule China. Now, of course, there were very, very great mistakes made under the communists. Under Mao in particular that we mentioned. But that was so. Anyway, it was a long, long road. There was a lot of chaos. There were a lot of missteps. There were a lot of movements that arose and then collapsed. Because they weren't really based on reality. And I see something similar happening in the U.S. at the present time. Again, we live in a very different time. We're a very different kind of society. But I see a similar kind of chaos, a groping for answers, but a lack of real answers. A general skepticism and a resentment of our directed towards our authorities. But I don't see any kind of real discipline movement that can take over and replace what we have now.
I mean, we just trickle into chaos until something.
Yeah, well,
does it just something solidify? I mean, one thing you talked about was that the internet is providing, people to espouse their own views and be critical and try to establish credibility and sources of trust, to essentially to create a new institution. Like, okay, this is, and so potentially over time, we're in this chaotic period. People will maybe follow this guy, and this guy I found out is telling me nonsense. I find out 2 years later, and he begins to lose trust. But then people gravitate to certain people. I mean, like, that's why for like geopolitics, like what we do, like the Duran has become established, is because they have over the years shown themselves to be honest. When they made a mistake, they'll say, I was wrong about this, and that gives you credibility. And so this starts to become a pillar in sort of the geopolitical world. And over time, those things will grow. So maybe that's the way out, is that we see.
Yeah. I think so. I think you're right. I'm describing chaos, but I think it's not going to last forever. And there are going to be a lot of mistakes. There are going to be a lot of, false messiahs and whatever. But eventually, some movement will coalesce that will succeed, and that will be able to govern the country and rectify a lot of the the very, very serious errors that we've fallen into. I believe that it will happen. I just haven't, it may be a while, it may be decades.
Yeah, it's I think it's so different now because, I was asking about historical precedents because I always think it's interesting. We can learn a lot from history and see what happened in the past. But what's so different in this case where we have a complete lack of trust is that we do have the internet, and this did not exist back then. So the way that this plays out could be completely different. Yeah. Because before, you have to pool people together and put them in a physical building to create that institution. Right. Here, in terms of building the infrastructure for institutions, it's a digital infrastructure. It's the groundwork is laid there. It's a different highway of information. You don't have to, like I said, put people in some big fancy building with columns and then they wear hats and they say, I'm the expert, and say something like that,
Right. Though eventually
some homeless looking man like you.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Though you do at some point, things have to be done in the physical world. Obviously, you have to assemble an army and whatever. So it does have to get offline at some point. Yeah, but it can certainly start online. There's no question about it. Yeah, I think you're right. And also, a difference is that with, all this electronic instantaneous communication, I think things are happening faster than ever before. So change could be a lot quicker. Like in China, it took 150 years or something.